Imagine a family whose name was tied to ships, islands, and the kind of headlines that mixed wealth with heartbreak. The Onassis story isn't just about money. It's about people who lived under a spotlight they could never escape. In this video, we'll walk through their world. The power, the scandals, the love and the losses that made their name unforgettable. If you enjoy it, hit like and subscribe. It really helps me make more videos like this one. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments, whether it's your thoughts on the Onassis family, or just where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Part 1. The origins of a dynasty. When people think of the name Onassis, they usually picture marble yachts gliding across turquoise waters, or Jackie Kennedy stepping onto the deck of the Christina O with a silk scarf. But the story actually begins far from the glamour of Monaco or the quiet wealth of New York's Fifth Avenue. It begins in Smyrna, a bustling port city on the Aegean coast, modern-day Izmir, Turkey, where East and West met in a whirlwind of trade, languages, and ambition. In the early 20th century, Smyrna was a cosmopolitan hub. Greek merchants, Armenian traders, Turkish officials, Levantine bankers, and European consuls shared its streets. For a boy named Aristotle Socrates Onassis, born in 1906, it was the perfect classroom in wealth and survival. The Onassis family wasn't poor. Aristotle's father, Socrates Onassis, traded in tobacco, an industry that at the time was a passport into the world of commerce. Tobacco was Smyrna's gold, a crop that traveled in barrels and crates across the Mediterranean to the salons of Paris and London. Young Aristotle grew up watching the rhythms of money. Ships arriving, deals closing, fortunes made and lost with every shipment. But that prosperity was fragile, built on a region teetering unsteadily between empires. To understand Aristotle's beginnings, picture a child raised in a house on the edge of a cliff. The view is magnificent. Ships, markets, a world of opportunity stretching to the horizon. But beneath that home, the ground trembles with political fault lines. In 1922, when Greek forces withdrew from Smyrna at the end of the Greco-Turkish War, tragedy struck. The city burned. Tens of thousands died and hundreds of thousands fled. The Onassis family, like so many others, became refugees. Aristotle's early life changed overnight, from comfort to survival. He went from being the son of a respected merchant to a displaced teenager with little more than determination in his pocket. Imagine for a moment what it feels like when the foundations of your life are ripped away. One day you're sitting at the family table with silver cutlery and servants. The next, you're huddled in a refugee camp, clutching your belongings in a bundle. It leaves a scar, but it also lights a spark. For Aristotle, that scar became a lifelong hunger to build something so vast and so lasting that no fire, no war, no political upheaval could ever take it from him again. The story of his reinvention began in Buenos Aires. At just 17, Aristotle boarded a ship bound for Argentina carrying little money but boundless ambition. He started as a humble telephone operator, listening in on conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. Yet in those voices, businessmen discussing deals, diplomats gossiping, he found an informal education. He learned how the wealthy spoke, how they maneuvered, how they thought. Every call was a free seminar in power. To most, it was just noise on the line. To Aristotle, it was a roadmap. Buenos Aires in the 1920s was a city of promise. Argentina was rich in beef and grain, and its avenues were lined with European-style cafes and theaters. For an immigrant willing to work hard, doors could open. But Aristotle didn't just want to walk through those doors. He wanted to own the house. He drew on his tobacco background, striking deals with Greek contacts and eventually building a small business exporting cigarettes. He blended local Argentine tobacco with fine mixtures and marketed them to Greeks living abroad. It was a smart move. He wasn't just selling tobacco. He was selling familiarity, nostalgia in the form of smoke. For Greeks far from home, a cigarette became a memory of the Aegean. This resourcefulness, turning displacement into opportunity, became the hallmark of Aristotle's rise. Think of a chess player who has lost half his pieces but uses the remaining pawns to trap his opponent's queen. Onassis played with what he had, and he did it brilliantly. But framing Aristotle's beginnings as purely entrepreneurial misses the deeper truth. His ambition was personal, almost emotional. He was a man constantly proving he would never be powerless again. that he would never again be the refugee hauling a bundle down a crowded dock. The yachts, the mansions, the glamorous companions. All of it was theater, yes, but it was also armor. Every deal, every property, every ship was a brick in a fortress built against memory. There's a saying among old immigrant communities, "We left with nothing, so we had to dream bigger than everyone else." Aristotle embodied that spirit. While others sought stability, he sought an empire. While others rebuilt modest lives, he built something that rivaled nations. His fleet of ships would eventually carry a significant share of the world's oil. His fortune would let him buy islands and estates that once belonged only to kings. But in these early years, what stands out isn't the empire yet. It's the forging of character. Picture a diamond under pressure, coal transformed by heat, darkness, and time. Aristotle Onassis was forged in the fires of Smyrna's destruction and polished on the avenues of Buenos Aires. His hunger wasn't abstract. It had roots in loss. And so, as we step into the Onassis story, we don't begin with dazzling ballrooms or sun-soaked decks, but with the ashes of a city and a young man determined never again to be at the mercy of history. From Smyrna to Argentina, from tobacco stalls to whispers on telephone lines, Aristotle began the journey that would carry him to the very heart of 20th century wealth and society. The origins of the dynasty remind us that luxury is often built on wounds, and that behind every marble facade lies a story of struggle, survival, and reinvention. For the Onassis family, that foundation of hunger would become both their strength and their curse, shaping the way their fortunes rose, and the way they would later fracture. Part 2. Fortune on the Seas. When Aristotle Onassis looked at a harbor, he didn't just see ships. He saw floating fortunes, steel kingdoms capable of carrying the wealth of nations. The sea had always been the backdrop of Greek life, from Homer's Odyssey to the fishing boats dotting every coastal town. But Onassis took that inheritance and turned it into a global empire. He didn't inherit fleets or centuries of shipping tradition like Europe's old maritime dynasties. He started with scraps, bargains, and ideas others discarded. And yet, within a single generation, he became master of the seas. To understand his genius, you have to place yourself in the economic moment of the early 20th century. Oil was becoming the lifeblood of modern industry. Cars, planes, power plants, everything needed oil. But oil is useless if it can't move. Pipelines were limited. Rail transport was costly. The future was in ocean tankers. And Aristotle Onassis was one of the first to see it clearly. At first, his entry into shipping seemed modest. In the late 1920s, he acquired 2 old cargo ships. They weren't glamorous. They were the kind of vessels most established companies would have scrapped. Imagine walking into a used car lot where every vehicle is rusted and missing wheels. Those were his first ships. But Aristotle understood something crucial. The sea doesn't care if a ship is old, only whether it floats and carries cargo. He bought cheap, operated efficiently, and turned a profit where others saw only risk. During the Great Depression, when most men with money hoarded it, Onassis spent. He saw opportunity in collapse. Ships were selling for a fraction of their value, and he snapped them up aggressively. It was like a chess player sacrificing pawns to corner a king. While the old shipping families hesitated, he moved boldly. This contrarian instinct, buying when others fled, became one of his lifelong strategies. But his real breakthrough came with tankers. Oil transport in the 1930s was still developing. Onassis realized that scale mattered. The bigger the tanker, the lower the cost per barrel. He began commissioning ships larger than the era's standard, betting that oil demand would only keep growing. And he was right. By the 1940s and 1950s, his tankers dwarfed those of many competitors. Each one was a floating gold mine, earning him contracts with the major oil companies, which wanted efficiency above all else. One of his boldest moves was registering ships under flags of convenience. At the time, shipping was tied to high taxes and strict regulations in traditional maritime nations like Britain or Greece. Onassis got around this by registering his fleet in Panama, and later Liberia, countries with minimal oversight. This let him cut costs dramatically. Old money shipowners looked down on him, calling it cheap and dishonorable. But it worked, and soon many of those same competitors quietly copied him. Onassis's cunning also extended to diplomacy. He negotiated directly with governments, often securing deals that went far beyond ordinary business. In one famous instance, he signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia for exclusive oil shipping rights. Though it was later challenged by the major oil companies, it revealed his audacity. He didn't just want contracts. He wanted monopolies. He wasn't afraid to walk into palaces and negotiate with kings, using charm, persistence, and at times sheer nerve to secure terms no one else would even attempt. Picture him at this stage not in boardrooms surrounded by charts, but in shipyards, leaning against hulls, breathing in the salt air, watching welders at work. He loved ships, their lines, their power. But he also loved the game, outmaneuvering men who had inherited fleets, proving that intelligence and hunger could beat pedigree. The comparison between Onassis and his rivals is striking. Many old shipping families in Britain and Northern Europe operated conservatively, relying on established networks and tradition. They were like aristocrats managing estates. Solid, predictable, but slow to change. Onassis was the upstart gambler. Where they invested cautiously, he doubled down. Where they saw risk, he saw leverage. That's why his empire grew so fast. It wasn't just money, it was mindset. World War II both threatened and enriched him. Several of his ships were lost, but shipping demand soared afterward. Rebuilding Europe required oil, steel, grain, all transported by sea. Onassis expanded furiously, buying up surplus Liberty ships from the United States and converting them for commercial use. Once again, he moved faster than his competitors, snapping up vessels before others recognized their worth. By the 1950s, Onassis controlled one of the largest private fleets in the world. His tankers carried the oil that powered cities, armies, and industries. He had turned the accidents of history, displacement as a refugee, Depression-era bargains, wartime chaos, into stepping stones. To put his achievement in perspective, imagine someone today arriving in a foreign city with little money, buying up a handful of failed startups no one else wants, and within 20 years building a company that dominates global tech. That's what Onassis did, only with steel, fuel, and oceans. But his shipping empire was more than business. It was theater. The sight of his colossal tankers in port was a statement, a visual reminder of his dominance. They were castles on the water, symbols of his power. At a time when oil shaped geopolitics, nations depended on the very vessels he commanded. His ships didn't just carry cargo, they carried history. This mastery of the seas brought him both fortune and fame, and laid the groundwork for everything else. The mansions, the yachts, the love affairs that captivated the tabloids. Without the tankers, there would have been no Scorpios, no marriage to Jackie Kennedy, no family saga written into the 20th century. The ocean, with its risks and its riches, was the canvas on which he painted his empire. And so, from scrap metal and steel, Aristotle Onassis charted his path to legend, proving that hunger and vision could overcome pedigree and tradition. His ships became his fortune, his reputation, and his weapon. They weren't simple trading vessels, but vehicles of ambition that carried him ever closer to the center of global power. Part 3. The world discovers Onassis. In Buenos Aires during the 1920s, the cafés buzzed with voices. Waiters in crisp white jackets served coffee strong enough to sharpen conversation, while cigarette smoke curled through the air like ribbons. At one of those café tables often sat a young Greek immigrant who carried himself as if he already belonged to the city's elite. Aristotle Onassis had little in his pockets, but he had something more valuable: presence. He spoke with charisma, dressed carefully even when he couldn't afford the finest fabrics, and leaned into conversations with a curiosity that made powerful men take notice. In a city full of ambitious newcomers, he stood out not for his wealth. He barely had any, but for a confidence that was almost audacious in scale. Buenos Aires was his stage, and he understood performance. He cultivated friendships with diplomats, journalists, and businessmen through sheer force of charm. If he couldn't pay the bill, he made sure his wit or his stories made up for it. Picture a man who could make even a borrowed suit look tailored in Paris. That was Onassis. It wasn't fortune yet, but it was the beginning of the show. As his cigarette business took off, he began upgrading his lifestyle in small but noticeable ways. A better suit here, a gold watch there. People began whispering his name. He was no longer just a trader. He was a figure, someone worth knowing. This was the moment Onassis began mastering not just commerce, but image. To him, business was never separate from persona. Every handshake, every dinner, every gesture was an investment in his brand. By the 1930s, with his shipping ventures growing, he moved into European circles. Monte Carlo, Paris, and later Monaco became natural magnets for a man who craved both legitimacy and glamour. There, he was no longer simply Aristotle, the ambitious Greek immigrant. He was Aristotle Onassis, the shipping magnate, the man who arrived in luxury cars and hosted gatherings where laughter and champagne flowed freely. High society at the time was both welcoming and wary of newcomers. Europe's old wealthy families had centuries of lineage behind them. They were used to wealth arriving through inheritance, not bold leaps from tobacco stalls and second-hand ships. Onassis fascinated them because he played their game but rejected their rules. He was like a chess player who turned the board sideways and still declared checkmate. He wore tuxedos, but he also proudly carried his outsider energy. He wasn't a lord or a count, but he could outspend them and often outshine them. Monaco became the center of his rise. The tiny principality was glamorous, a playground for royalty, Hollywood stars, and financiers. It was here that Onassis's love of spectacle truly blossomed. He bought shares in the Monte Carlo casino and forged friendships with royalty, most notably Prince Rainier. Picture the audacity, a refugee from Smyrna now sitting at tables with princes, discussing business and pleasure as if he'd been born into that world. This wasn't assimilation. It was conquest. One of his best tools was the yacht. For Onassis, the sea wasn't just business, it was theater. His later yacht, the Christina O, would become legendary. But even before that, he used ships as floating stages for high society gatherings. On a deck overlooking the Mediterranean, he blurred the lines between businessman and host, between magnate and mythmaker. People remembered not just the deals they closed with him, but the evenings spent in his company, watching the sun set over blue waters as glasses of Dom Perignon gleamed in their hands. Then there was his taste for romance. Onassis moved easily among some of the most famous women of his era, from opera diva Maria Callas to Jacqueline Kennedy. Even in the early days, he understood that being seen with the right companions elevated his status. Those relationships weren't only personal. They were also social capital, the kind that opened doors even money sometimes couldn't buy. His rise into high society wasn't smooth or uncontested. There were whispers that he was too bold, too new, too willing to bend the rules. And it was true. Onassis was never bound by convention. He closed deals others called reckless, operated through legal loopholes others found improper, and always seemed a step ahead of regulators. Yet that very boldness was what made him magnetic. He lived loudly in a world that often preferred quiet wealth. Consider this: Europe's old dynasties displayed wealth with restraint. A discreet country estate, a refined dinner, a family crest carved in stone. Onassis, by contrast, turned wealth into a spotlight. He wasn't simply rich, he was dazzling. If old money was a portrait in muted oils, Onassis was a neon sign against the night sky. And the world noticed. Newspapers covered his business ventures, but also his parties. Photographers followed him not just into boardrooms, but onto beaches, yachts, and opera houses. He understood early what many later magnates would discover, that in the 20th century, image was as powerful as capital. Being rich wasn't enough. Being seen as rich, glamorous, and untouchable was the real prize. From the cafés of Buenos Aires to the salons of Monaco, Aristotle Onassis perfected this dance. He built his empire in steel, but gilded it with champagne, silk, and spectacle. Part 4. Grosvenor Square, London. A stage for the elite. If Buenos Aires was Aristotle Onassis's training ground and Monaco his stage, then Grosvenor Square in London was where his world most visibly intersected with the very definition of old money society. The mansion Onassis acquired in Mayfair was more than brick and mortar. It was a statement. It announced that he, the refugee child from Smyrna who once counted cigarettes for a living, now held a seat among Europe's aristocracy. In London's grandest district, where mansions stood like stone fortresses for dukes, bankers, and ambassadors, the name Onassis appeared on the same roll. For Americans, Grosvenor Square evokes embassy life and World War II planning rooms. For Onassis, It evoked something different: legitimacy. The mansion wasn't just a family residence. It was also a salon of influence, a meeting point where power and glamour intertwined. Here, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, already the most photographed woman in the world, received guests beneath chandeliers that had once shone for lords and ladies of the British Empire. Here, too, her sister Lee Radziwill drifted through the rooms, weaving Kennedy mystique together with European aristocratic grace. The house itself carried all the hallmarks of Mayfair grandeur: imposing staircases, polished parquet floors, gilt-framed mirrors, and ceilings painted with soft frescoes. Think of it as the architectural equivalent of a tuxedo: impeccable, restrained, yet capable of radiating a certain austere luxury. But when the Onassis family hosted an evening, restraint disappeared. Towers of champagne sparkled, musicians filled the air with jazz or chamber pieces, and the guest lists read like something pulled from the society columns of the Times and Le Figaro. Jackie's presence gave Grosvenor Square its aura. Even in London, a city accustomed to royalty, she was magnetic. Guests whispered about her grace, her fashion, her air of tragedy transformed into resilience. Some came to catch a glimpse of Aristotle's fortune, but most came to see the woman who had once walked the halls of the White House. In many ways, the mansion became Jackie's European stage, a safe haven from the New York press, but also a bridge into aristocratic circles she both admired and quietly rivaled. Lee Radziwill, Jackie's younger sister, added another layer of appeal. As a princess by marriage, she brought her own connections to European nobility. Together, the sisters turned Grosvenor Square into a kind of family court, a place where the Kennedys mingled with the Windsors, where Greek shipping magnates rubbed shoulders with English dukes. For guests, it was intoxicating. Crossing those doors meant stepping into a tableau where politics, glamour, and wealth danced together. But the house was more than glitter. For Onassis's children, Christina and Alexander, Grosvenor Square was a point of stability in a life often lived on yachts, planes, and islands. Here they experienced a kind of grounding. Tutors arrived at the door. Family dinners unfolded in candlelit dining rooms. For all its formality, the house carried the pulse of family life. Aristotle used Grosvenor Square strategically. It was a hub where business overlapped with pleasure. Deals floated over cocktails. Contracts hinted at over-dinner courses. In Britain, where tradition still carried enormous weight, the address itself was a kind of calling card. To be received at Grosvenor Square was to be recognized not just as wealthy, but as socially significant. The paradox of Grosvenor Square, however, was that while it gave Onassis the legitimacy of old money surroundings, he never fully belonged. Guests loved the spectacle, but whispers about his boldness, his outsider origins, and his relentless ambition never fully disappeared. Yet, in a way, this was his triumph. They could murmur, but they couldn't ignore him. His house, his guest list, his wife guaranteed his name stayed at the center of European society's conversations. Think of Grosvenor Square as a theater. The facade was the curtain, grand stone, dignified. Inside, the rooms were the stage where performances of status played out. The actors were Jackie, Lee, Christina, and Aristotle himself. Each played roles that fascinated an audience of aristocrats, magnates, and socialites. The script was improvised, but the theme was always the same. Power dressed in elegance, tragedy turned into glamour, money reimagined as legitimacy. Part 5. Fifth Avenue, New York. Jackie's Refuge. On Manhattan's Fifth Avenue, right across from Central Park, stood one of America's most symbolic addresses. Fifth Avenue had long been a corridor of aspiration, where the wealthy lived not just in comfort, but in full view of the world. For Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who carried both the glamour of Camelot and the shadow of tragedy, her apartment there was more than an address. It was a sanctuary, a space where public life ended at the door and private healing began. After President John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Jackie became the most famous widow in the world. Every public appearance, every word, every expression was dissected by newspapers and magazines. She needed a place to step back, a place where her children could grow up without the constant flash of cameras and where she could redefine herself away from the suffocating myth of Camelot. Fifth Avenue offered her that refuge. The apartment was elegant, austere compared to the sprawling estates and gilded salons she often frequented, but that was precisely why it mattered. Here, Jackie could exist without performance. The windows looked out over Central Park, where the seasons softened the city's relentless pace. In spring, she walked beneath blossoming trees. In autumn, she watched leaves fall over quiet paths. The interior carried her personal imprint. She filled it with books, photographs, and carefully chosen artwork. Never excessive, always thoughtful. Friends recalled that the space felt less like a palace and more like a cultivated retreat, one that balanced sophistication with intimacy. For her children, Caroline and John Jr., the apartment became a steady anchor. In a life marked by constant travel between Hyannisport, Washington, Scorpios, and Paris, Fifth Avenue was the address that gave them a sense of normalcy. When Jackie married Aristotle Onassis in 1968, the Fifth Avenue apartment remained central to her life. Though she traveled to Scorpios, to Paris, to the yachts and villas of the Mediterranean, she always returned here. It symbolized her American identity at a time when critics accused her of turning her back on it. The press, often cruel, framed her marriage as a betrayal of the Kennedy legacy. Yet the Fifth Avenue home was proof she hadn't abandoned her roots. It was where she wasn't Mrs. Onassis, the socialite, but Jackie the mother, Jackie the reader, Jackie the woman finding her own way after unbearable loss. For Aristotle, the apartment had its uses too. It was a place to be seen when he was in New York, a bridge between his Mediterranean empire and American society. Yet unlike the grand theaters of Grosvenor Square or Scorpios, the Fifth Avenue apartment belonged more to Jackie than to him. It was her territory, a space where she set the tone, where elegance was subtle and privacy was sacred. The symbolism of the address can't be overstated. Fifth Avenue had long been synonymous with old money families. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys. By settling there, Jackie not only joined that tradition but redefined it. She brought with her the aura of the White House, the lingering romance of Camelot, and the modern resilience of a woman navigating a new life. In many ways, she turned Fifth Avenue into her own stage, but one where the performance was quieter, more personal. The apartment also represented continuity across the chapters of her life. It was the place she returned to after seasons on Scorpios, after summers at Redgate Farm, after years in Washington. No matter how much the world changed, Fifth Avenue remained. For a woman who had watched her husband assassinated in front of her, who had raised her children under international scrutiny, that constancy mattered. It was, in its own way, her anchor. Part 6. Scorpios, the Purchased Paradise. There are islands that exist in geography books, and then there are islands that live in the imagination. Scorpios, a rocky outcrop off Greece's western coast, belonged to the first category until Aristotle Onassis bought it in 1963 and turned it into the second. What had been an overlooked speck in the Ionian Sea became one of the world's most famous private islands, a symbol not just of wealth, but of control, vision, and theater. Scorpios wasn't simply land. It was a miniature empire, sculpted to reflect Onassis's desires. When he bought it, it was little more than scrubland, sparse vegetation, rocky terrain, no infrastructure. To most, it was a bad investment. But Aristotle saw what others couldn't. He imagined an Eden where barren soil could become paradise. To make that dream real, he had thousands of trees shipped over with fertile soil from the mainland and planted groves of olive and pine trees. He had sand imported to create beaches where none existed. Every decision was a performance of power. He was rewriting nature itself. The scale of the transformation was staggering. Engineers installed water systems, roads, and electricity. Villas rose from the island's hillsides, designed with marble, terraces, and panoramic sea views. Gardens bloomed with exotic flowers brought from distant lands. For Onassis, the island also carried symbolic resonance. In Greek mythology, islands often served as realms for gods, heroes, and exiles. Owning one meant stepping into that mythic tradition. Scorpios became his Olympus, his private kingdom in the Ionian, a place where he wasn't just a magnate, but a sovereign. The island quickly became synonymous with Onassis's power. When he hosted gatherings there, the guest lists read like a who's who of 20th century influence. Princes, presidents, prime ministers, artists, and magnates. It was here that Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle in 1968 in a ceremony that both shocked and fascinated the world. Images of Jackie in her white Valentino dress against the backdrop of Scorpios' beaches ran on front pages everywhere, cementing the island's association with spectacle. Beyond weddings, The island hosted countless gatherings where champagne flowed, orchestras played, and the Mediterranean night echoed with laughter. Winston Churchill, Maria Callas, and a parade of Hollywood figures passed through its villas. Journalists described Scorpios as a floating court. Though anchored in the Ionian, it functioned like a private Versailles where invitations themselves conferred prestige. To be on Scorpios was to be inside the legend, part of the Onassis story. Yet Scorpios wasn't just a playground. It was also a fortress. Onassis used it as a retreat from the relentless attention of the press and the constant demands of business. Here he controlled every detail: who came in, what was seen, how the story unfolded. The island also carried darker notes. Christina Onassis, Aristotle's daughter, grew up spending summers there. For her, Scorpios was both paradise and prison. While her father entertained the world's elite, she often felt isolated, trapped within the gilded environment he had created. Later in life, she would describe her childhood on Scorpios as lonely despite the glittering company. The lasting irony of Scorpios is that, like many symbols of power, it outlived the man who created it. After Onassis's death in 1975, the island passed through his heirs, was sold, and reshaped again by new billionaires. Yet the name Scorpios remains inseparable from Onassis. It's a word that evokes not just a place, but an era. The golden age of the Mediterranean, when one man's vision turned a forgotten island into a global icon. Part 7. The Christina O.A. Floating Empire. If Scorpios was Aristotle Onassis's kingdom on land, the Christina O was his empire at sea. Few symbols of 20th century wealth captured the imagination like this yacht, a remarkable vessel that carried on its decks more history, gossip, and spectacle than perhaps any other ship afloat. From its origins as a wartime frigate to its rebirth as a floating palace, the Christina O was more than a yacht. It was a statement, a stage, and a legend. The story begins after World War II. The Canadian Navy decommissioned a surplus frigate, a battered warship that had escorted convoys through the deadly waters of the Atlantic. To most, it was scrap headed for rust. To Onassis, it was raw material. He bought the vessel for a fraction of its value and then poured millions into transforming it into something no one had ever seen, a yacht that rivaled royal palaces. The conversion was meticulous and imaginative. Architects stripped away the frigate's utilitarian skeleton and rebuilt it with suites, salons, and decks designed for leisure rather than battle. The ship measured over 90 meters, dwarfing most private yachts of the era. Onassis installed a grand staircase, a pool that could transform into a dance floor at the push of a button, and cabins that rivaled the finest five-star hotels. Fine wood, Italian marble, and chandeliers gleamed where only metal bulkheads and ammunition racks had once stood. But what truly set the Christina O apart wasn't just its design, it was its role as a gathering place. Onassis used it as a floating salon where politics, art, and glamour mixed freely. Picture the guest list: Winston Churchill sipping whiskey in the wood-paneled library, Maria Callas singing informally in the dining room, Marilyn Monroe leaning against the railings under a Mediterranean sunset. Hollywood stars, heads of state, royalty, all came aboard. For them, the yacht was more than a venue. It was a passport into Onassis's world, where deals were whispered as easily as jokes and where the atmosphere blurred the line between diplomacy and decadence. Onassis understood that the yacht wasn't just a luxury, but a stage of power. Hosting Churchill, for instance, gave him credibility in political circles. Entertaining film stars gave him currency in the world of glamour. Every guest who came aboard lent him a piece of their reputation. And in exchange, they borrowed his aura of limitless wealth. In this way, the Christina O functioned as an engine that constantly generated prestige. And yet, the yacht was also deeply personal. Named after his daughter Christina, it was meant to root his legend in family as much as fortune. For Christina herself, the yacht was both a source of pride and a burden. She grew up in its cabins, but also in its shadow, as her father's obsession with spectacle often left her emotionally adrift. Perhaps the yacht's most famous feature was its pool, ringed with mosaics depicting the myth of the Minotaur. The floor could rise to create a dance platform, turning an afternoon swim into a nighttime gala. It was a perfect metaphor for Onassis himself, practical ingenuity fused with theatrical flair. The Christina O also carried an air of secrecy. Deals were made in its private salons. Affairs were whispered about in its cabins, and gossip flowed as freely as the champagne. Guests who came aboard often left with stories they couldn't tell in public, only in hushed tones afterward. For the press, the yacht became synonymous with Onassis's excess. Photographs of Jackie Kennedy Onassis sunbathing on its deck circulated worldwide, fusing American Camelot with Mediterranean opulence. To critics, it was vulgar, the overcompensation of an immigrant. To admirers, it was brilliant, proof that ambition could rewrite destiny. Calling the Christina O.A. yacht undersells it. It was a floating empire that carried not just passengers, but narratives, dreams, and symbols. It embodied everything that made Onassis unforgettable. The transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, the blurring of business and pleasure, the obsession with being not just rich but extraordinary. In steel and teak, in marble and mosaic, the Christina O told the world who Aristotle Onassis was. Not simply a magnate, but a man who made the sea itself his stage. Part 8. Jackie and Aristotle. A marriage of icons. Few marriages of the 20th century generated as much fascination, scandal, and endless speculation as that of Jacqueline Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis. It was a union that seemed both inevitable and impossible. America's most elegant first lady, whose husband's death had made her a global symbol of mourning, and the world's most notorious shipping magnate, whose reputation was as dazzling as it was controversial. When Jackie Kennedy married Onassis in 1968, the world was stunned. To many Americans, she was the eternal widow of John F. Kennedy, forever wrapped in black veils and devotion to Camelot. Seeing her aboard a yacht in the Aegean in a Valentino dress, pledging herself to a man 2 decades older, was nothing short of shocking. Newspapers called it betrayal. Columnists accused her of selling herself for money. Even members of the Kennedy family reportedly reacted with disbelief. But for Jackie, the choice was far more complicated than the headlines suggested. Since JFK's assassination, she had lived under constant threat and scrutiny. The killings of her husband and later Robert Kennedy deepened her fear that she and her children were targets. Onassis, with his immense wealth and near-obsessive control over his surroundings, offered something few men could: security. He had private islands, private yachts, private jets, worlds he could seal off from the chaos of politics and the threat of violence. For Jackie, marrying Onassis wasn't only romance. It was refuge. For Onassis, marrying Jackie Kennedy was the ultimate symbol of his arrival. He had built fleets that carried the oil of empires. He had created islands, palaces, and yachts that dazzled the world. Yet to many, he remained the outsider upstart, Greek, immigrant, brash, at times vulgar in the eyes of old European families. By marrying Jackie, he merged his fortune with America's most glamorous political dynasty. It was an image coup no rival could match. She brought him legitimacy, myth, and cultural capital. He gave her protection, luxury, and distance from tragedy. Yet beneath the glossy photographs, the marriage was never smooth. Aristotle was used to dominance. He had lived his life surrounded by women who admired him, who tolerated his affairs, who accepted his terms. Jackie, by contrast, was no mistress or socialite to be dazzled. She was a former First Lady raised in opulence, with her own sense of independence and dignity. Cultural differences magnified the tension. Jackie embodied a kind of American elegance, restrained, discreet, with pearls and tailored suits that spoke of subtle wealth. Aristotle radiated Mediterranean excess, cigars, laughter that filled rooms, gestures as grand as his fortune. The differences were irresistible to onlookers. To those close to them, they often caused friction. And then there was Maria Callas. The Greek opera diva had been Onassis's companion for years, and their relationship was passionate, stormy, and public. When Onassis married Jackie, Callas was devastated. Yet Aristotle never fully cut ties, and rumors of continued intimacy circulated endlessly. For Jackie, who had already endured public humiliation over JFK's infidelities, this added another layer of pain. Even so, the marriage had moments of genuine tenderness. Jackie and Aristotle shared evenings on Scorpios where the Mediterranean air softened the sharp edges of their union. He admired her intelligence and grace. She valued his confidence and his ability to shield her from a world that had often treated her cruelly. For her children, Caroline and John Jr., Aristotle played the role of protector, making sure they were kept safe and free from the constant presence of paparazzi. But as the years passed, the cracks widened. Onassis grew frustrated with Jackie's coolness and her insistence on independence. Jackie grew weary of his volatility and infidelities. Friends recalled dinners where the silences stretched on, or moments when Jackie would slip away from the island to retreat into books and letters. For all its symbolism, the marriage was less a fairy tale and more a truce. Two icons using each other to navigate a world that demanded too much of both. In hindsight, the scandal surrounding their union says as much about society as it does about them. Jackie's marriage to Onassis forced Americans to confront the gap between myth and reality. She wasn't frozen in mourning. She was a woman making choices, some pragmatic, some emotional, all human. What endures, however, is the fascination. Photographs of Jackie on the deck of the Christina O, sunglasses hiding her eyes, Aristotle nearby with his ever-present cigar, remain etched in the cultural memory of the 20th century. Theirs was a marriage that belonged as much to history as to themselves. They weren't simply husband and wife. They were symbols colliding, the widow of Camelot and the richest man in the world, joined in a marriage that carried the weight of myth and scandal, of power and fragility. Part 9. Family tensions and personal tragedies. For all the yachts, islands, and headlines of dazzling power, the Onassis dynasty was never free of shadow. If Aristotle Onassis built an empire of steel and spectacle, he also left behind a family marked by tension, loneliness, and loss. Behind the images of Jackie's sunglasses on the deck of the Christina O, or Aristotle's booming laughter in a Mayfair ballroom, lay quieter, darker realities that slowly unraveled the dream of a lasting dynasty. The story begins with Aristotle's children from his first marriage to Athena Levanos, Alexander and Christina. To the outside world, they were the heirs to unimaginable wealth. Golden children living on yachts and private islands. But wealth isolates as much as it comforts. Alexander and Christina grew up in a world where their father's presence loomed like a monument, admired from outside, feared at home, and impossible to escape. Alexander, the only son, carried the heavy weight of expectation. Aristotle pictured him taking the helm of the shipping empire, steering tankers and investments into the future. Yet Alexander never quite fit the mold. He was sensitive, rebellious, and often resisted the path laid out for him. Friends remembered him as a young man who loved aviation more than business, who sought freedom in the skies while his father demanded discipline in the boardroom. Then, in 1973, tragedy struck. At just 24, Alexander died in a plane crash near Athens while piloting his own aircraft. The news shattered Aristotle. For all his power, for all his ships and estates, he was helpless against fate. Witnesses described a man transformed overnight. His booming confidence dimmed, his shoulders sagged. It wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of a budding dynasty. Alexander's death meant there was no natural heir to carry forward the empire Aristotle had spent his life building. Christina Onassis carried a different but equally heavy burden. As the daughter of one of the world's richest men, she lived in palaces and aboard yachts. But she was also deeply lonely. Her father's dominance often overshadowed her, and her mother's high society world exposed her to endless scrutiny. Christina grew into a woman of notable intelligence and sharp wit. But her personal life was plagued by instability. She married 4 times, and each union ended in divorce. Newspapers delighted in the stories, painting her as the troubled heiress, unable to find happiness. Beneath the headlines, though, were the struggles of a woman who had lost her brother young, her father soon after, and whose inheritance carried more curse than blessing. The tragedies piled up one after another. After Alexander's death in 1973, Aristotle's health began declining rapidly. Just 2 years later, in 1975, he himself died, leaving Christina as the principal heir. At only 30, she inherited not only one of the largest private fortunes in the world, but also the crushing responsibility of managing an empire she had never truly wanted. Christina's final years were marked by a spiral of health problems, emotional turmoil, and isolation. She moved between continents, Paris, Buenos Aires, New York, searching for homes that never quite became true refuges. Despite her fortune, she confided to friends that she felt like a prisoner of money. She had everything others envied, but little of what she actually wanted. In 1988, at just 37, Christina Onassis was found dead in a bathtub in Buenos Aires. The official cause was pulmonary edema, but speculation swirled around her fragile health, her depression, and the weight of her life. Her daughter Athena, only 3 years old, became the sole surviving heir to the Onassis fortune. What had once been a family conceived as a dynasty, with generations meant to steer fleets and lead society, had been reduced to a single, fragile daughter. The arc of the Onassis family reads almost like a Greek tragedy, which is fitting given their origins. A patriarch who rose from refugee to magnate, determined to build a fortress of wealth. A son, the chosen heir, lost in the prime of youth. A daughter left with riches but haunted by loneliness. And finally, a dynasty reduced to a single, fragile thread. No fortune, however vast, protects a family from grief. Part 10. The New Jersey Horse Farm, an escape to the countryside. In the gentle hills of Somerset County, New Jersey, there's a corner of America that feels worlds away from the skyscrapers of Manhattan or the marble terraces of Scorpios. Known as horse country, the region around Peapack Gladstone has long attracted those who love the rhythms of equestrian life. Fox hunts on autumn mornings, stables filled with polished saddles, and wide fields that seem to stretch endlessly beneath the sun. For Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, this landscape was more than an escape. It was a return to something elemental, a space where she could breathe, and where horses themselves came to embody both control and freedom in her complicated life. Jackie's connection to horses began in childhood, long before she was First Lady or the wife of a shipping magnate. As a girl raised on Long Island, she found joy in riding, mastering the discipline of equestrian sport with remarkable skill. Photographs from her youth show her sitting tall in the saddle, confident and serene. When she acquired the estate in Peapack Gladstone during her years with Aristotle Onassis, it was as if she were reclaiming a part of herself that the public had almost erased. To most of the world, Jackie was the black-veiled widow, or the woman photographed on the deck of the Christina O. But in New Jersey, far from the cameras and gossip, she could pull on her riding boots, tie back her hair, and ride across the countryside with the wind on her face. The estate itself reflected this duality of elegance and simplicity. It was large enough for someone of Jackie's stature, with stables, paddocks, and sprawling gardens. Yet it wasn't ostentatious. Unlike the salons of Grosvenor Square or the terraces of Scorpios, the house was built for both utility and comfort. Its true heart was the stables, where grooms cared for the horses and Jackie could disappear into the quiet rituals of equestrian care. Horses, for Jackie, carried symbolic weight. In a life so often at the mercy of events, assassinations, tragedies, public scrutiny, riding gave her a sense of control. On horseback, she set the pace, the rhythm, the path forward. Yet riding also carried the paradox of freedom. When a horse gallops, there's surrender alongside control. You yield to the animal's power, trusting its strength even as you guide it. The estate also became a refuge for her children. Caroline and John Jr. spent weekends there, free to run through the fields and play without the constant gaze of city streets. Jackie, who had watched her children photographed and scrutinized since birth, found relief in seeing them fold into a community where horses, not headlines, set the agenda. Part 11. Redgate Farm, the New American Estate. On the windswept shores of Martha's Vineyard sits Redgate Farm, a 340-acre property that became Jackie Kennedy Onassis's true American sanctuary. Purchased in 1979, just 4 years after Aristotle Onassis's death, the estate was a decisive gesture, turning a page, a return to American soil, and a merging of two legacies, the Kennedy romance of Camelot and the resources of the Onassis fortune. Redgate Farm wasn't simply another property. It was Jackie's declaration that she could finally build a life on her own terms. The estate itself, tucked away in Aquina on the island's quieter western end, looked nothing like the gilded salons of Grosvenor Square or the manicured perfection of Scorpios. Its beauty was raw, elemental. The Atlantic crashed against sand dunes. Wild meadows shifted with the seasons, dotted with deer and seabirds. Old stone walls stretched across rolling fields. For Jackie, who had lived in gilded cages, whether the White House, Fifth Avenue, or Scorpios, this landscape offered freedom. Make no mistake, though, it wasn't a retreat into rusticity. Jackie poured her wealth into transforming Redgate Farm into a refined, comfortable estate. The original house was modest, but she commissioned a larger residence that balanced traditional New England shingle style with touches of understated elegance. In many ways, Redgate Farm symbolized a synthesis of Jackie's life experiences. From the Kennedys, she inherited a love of New England summers, sailing, and family gatherings by the shore. From Onassis, she inherited the means to secure such a vast and private stretch of paradise. It was Kennedy romance subsidized by Onassis wealth, a fusion that perfectly embodied her identity in those years. For her children, Caroline and John Jr., the estate became a stabilizing force. They had grown up under the glow of Kennedy tragedy and Onassis extravagance. But on Martha's Vineyard, they found something close to normalcy. John Jr. surfed and played on the beach. Caroline rode horses through the meadows. Friends who visited recalled laughter echoing across the dunes, bonfires on the shore, and Jackie herself more relaxed than in any other setting. Symbolically, the estate carried enormous weight. While Jackie's years with Onassis had tied her to Greece, yachts, and European high society, Redgate Farm brought her firmly back into American history. It anchored her in Massachusetts, not far from the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport, reconnecting her with the family narrative so many Americans still cherished. The contrast between her two refuges, Scorpios and Redgate, is striking. Scorpios was about controlling nature, importing sand, planting trees, manufacturing paradise. Redgate Farm was about harmonizing with nature. Dunes left wild, meadows preserved, the sea accepted in all its relentless power. Scorpios was theater. Redgate Farm was authenticity. When she died in 1994, Redgate Farm stood as one of her most lasting legacies. It was the physical embodiment of her final act, not as Kennedy widow or Onassis wife, but as Jackie herself, independent and grounded. Part 12. The Onassis Business Mind. Aristotle Onassis never set out to be an old-style European gentleman trader. He was something different, a strategist, a gambler, and above all, a master at turning rules into tools. Where others saw restrictions, he saw opportunity. Where others followed tradition, he redefined it. Onassis's business genius began with a principle many magnates understand but few embody: control the bottleneck. In global trade, the bottleneck was oil. By the mid-20th century, oil was the oxygen of modern civilization. Yet it was useless sitting underground or in storage tanks. It had to move across oceans. Onassis saw that shipping was the critical choke point, and he placed himself directly at its center. While traditional shipowners treated oil transport as just another commodity, Onassis thought bigger. He commissioned tankers of unprecedented size, vessels that dwarfed existing ships. The logic was simple: the bigger the tanker, the lower the cost per barrel. By offering lower rates than the competition, he could strike deals oil companies couldn't refuse. His 1950s deal with Saudi Arabia exemplifies his boldness. While oil transport was traditionally controlled by the Seven Sisters, the Western companies that dominated global oil, Onassis bypassed them and negotiated directly with King Saud for exclusive rights to ship Saudi crude. It was a bold move that enraged established corporations and triggered legal and political battles. Though the deal eventually collapsed under pressure, it showed Onassis's willingness to challenge monopolies and rewrite the rules. Equally important was his use of flags of convenience. At a time when most fleets flew national flags, tying them to strict labor laws and taxes, Onassis pioneered registering his ships in Panama and later Liberia, countries with looser regulations and lower labor requirements. It was a revolutionary model that cut costs dramatically. Critics called it dishonorable. Yet soon many of those same critics quietly adopted the practice. Today, the vast majority of the world's merchant fleet sails under flags of convenience, a testament to Onassis's vision. Onassis also wielded charm and intimidation as business tools. He could be disarmingly persuasive, flattering a government minister one moment and then fiercely unyielding the next. Diplomats recalled how he entered meetings with an almost theatrical presence. Tailored suits, cigar in hand, his gravelly voice carrying both warmth and threat. Perhaps his greatest gift was the ability to see connections others missed. For Onassis, shipping was never just about ships. It was about geopolitics, psychology, and spectacle. He knew oil companies needed reliable transport, but also that governments craved prestige and individuals craved attention. Hosting ministers on the Christina O was as much a negotiating tactic as anything written into a contract. It blurred the line between leisure and leverage, making his lifestyle part of his business arsenal. Picture a chess player who not only anticipates his opponent's moves but occasionally rearranges the board mid-game, daring others to adapt. That was Onassis. He played on multiple levels at once: markets, governments, public opinion, and more often than not, he won. Part 13. Rivals, Friends, and Enemies. Building an empire as bold as Aristotle Onassis's meant inviting rivals at every turn. Onassis's most famous rival was Stavros Niarchos, a Greek shipping magnate who shared not just his industry, but his ambition and his taste for grandeur. If Onassis was flamboyant, Niarchos was refined. If Onassis reveled in spectacle, Niarchos cultivated discretion. The two men circled each other like predators, competing for contracts, ships, and at times even women. Niarchos married into the Livanos family, the same powerful Greek dynasty that had once united Onassis with his first wife, Athina Livanos. Their rivalry, then, wasn't just economic but deeply personal. Both men commissioned ever larger tankers, each determined to prove himself master of the seas. They outbid each other for contracts, sometimes cutting rates so low that profit became secondary to prestige. In the shipping world, their duel was legendary. Governments, too, became both allies and adversaries. Onassis's success depended on navigating national regulations and international treaties. His use of flags of convenience angered maritime nations watching their tax revenues evaporate. His 1950s Saudi oil shipping deal enraged American oil giants, who pressured Washington to block him. At times he seemed less a businessman than a shadow statesman, negotiating with kings and presidents in ways that blurred sovereignty. Yet Onassis had a gift for cultivating friendships with the very people who might oppose him. Politicians, aristocrats, and royalty found their way onto the Christina O or into the villas of Scorpios. Winston Churchill, who might have dismissed him as a brash intruder, instead enjoyed Onassis's hospitality, his cigars, his whiskey. For Onassis, entertaining wasn't idle pleasure. It was diplomacy by other means. At his core, Onassis thrived on conflict. Rivals like Niarchos sharpened him. Government clashes tested him. Uneasy friendships elevated him. He seemed to draw energy from navigating opposition, as if the constant need to outdo others confirmed his place at the table. Part 14. Scandal and the Press. To understand the Onassis family, you also have to understand the relentless glare they lived under. Wealth alone draws attention, but the combination of fortune, power, and glamour surrounding Aristotle Onassis and his circle was irresistible to the press. Aristotle himself courted attention as much as he suffered from it. He knew that hosting Winston Churchill on the deck of the Christina O would generate headlines, and that those headlines would reinforce his stature. For a man who had risen from refugee status in Smyrna to one of the richest men in the world, every photograph with a head of state or a film star was not just vanity but strategy. But the press is a double-edged sword, and the Onassis family learned this brutally. His long affair with Maria Callas was reported with breathless fascination. Their passionate fights, reconciliations, and eventual falling out filled gossip columns across Europe. When Onassis abruptly married Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968, the media storm was immediate and relentless. The paparazzi phenomenon peaked in the 60s and 70s, and Jackie Onassis was one of its most hunted targets. Her oversized sunglasses became iconic not just for their elegance, but for their practical purpose, a shield against flashing cameras. Her lawsuits against aggressive paparazzi in the 70s helped fuel broader debates about privacy rights. For Christina Onassis, the glare was even crueler. Newspapers branded her the unhappy heiress, a woman adrift despite her billions. Every failed marriage, every health episode, every weight fluctuation became fodder for headlines. She once confided to friends that she felt she had no identity apart from the stories written about her. The press also played a central role in amplifying the family's tragedies. Alexander Onassis's death in a plane crash was reported worldwide within hours. Aristotle's collapse after losing his son was described in detail. Even in grief, the Onassis family couldn't escape the world's gaze. For the public, the Onassis saga was intoxicating because it fused fairy tale luxury with soap opera drama. It was as if ancient Greek tragedy had been rewritten for modern tabloids. A self-made titan, a glamorous widow, a betrayed diva, an unhappy heiress, a son lost too soon. Part 15. Legacy in Architecture and Art. For a man whose life was defined by motion, tankers crossing oceans, planes flying between continents, yachts anchored in Mediterranean coves, Aristotle Onassis also left behind a world of permanence. His estates, his interiors, his taste in art and architecture formed a legacy as tangible as steel hulls or financial empires. Unlike many old money dynasties who inherited collections and mansions layered with centuries of taste, Onassis was a self-made man. He didn't inherit palaces. He built them. He didn't grow up surrounded by Renaissance masters or Rococo furniture. He acquired them later with deliberate intention. Scorpios remains perhaps the boldest example. When Onassis bought it in the 1960s, it was little more than dry, sparse scrubland. He remade it with an almost artistic obsession, importing sand to create beaches, transplanting thousands of trees to cover its hillsides, and building villas that blended restrained modernism with Mediterranean flavor. The Christina O also functioned as gallery and vessel at once. The famous pool mosaic with its mythological motif was itself a work of art. Inside, Onassis selected paneling, paintings, and sculptures that created a sense of timeless elegance. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, with her own refined aesthetic sense, left her mark on the family's architectural legacy. Her Fifth Avenue apartment in New York was chic and serene. At Redgate Farm on Martha's Vineyard, her influence reached its fullest expression. The house she designed there reflected New England tradition. Cedar shingles, wide porches, and interiors filled with books, art, and objects gathered from her travels. If Scorpios was a monument to Onassis's ambition, Redgate Farm was a monument to Jackie's resilience. What remains striking about the Onassis family's architectural and artistic legacy is its durability. Decades after their deaths, the estates they built and the interiors they shaped still captivate. In architecture and art, the Onassis legacy isn't simply about displayed wealth. It's about wealth translated into story. Every estate, every artwork, every interior told the world something about their owners. Their aspirations, their contradictions, their need to be seen, and their longing to retreat. Part 16. Christina Onassis, the heiress under the spotlight. Christina Onassis entered the world already carrying a name that weighed like an anchor. To outsiders, she was the ultimate heiress. Daughter of Aristotle Onassis, raised on yachts, penthouses, and private islands. Her life unfolded before the cameras of the international press, which delighted in documenting every twist of her story. From childhood, Christina was surrounded by symbols of excess. She played in the salons of Grosvenor Square, rode her bike along the beaches of Scorpios, and attended dinners where the guests were royalty, film stars, or heads of state. Yet that environment came with its own prison bars. Friends described Christina as brilliant, witty, and sharp-tongued, traits that occasionally clashed with her father's overwhelming presence. Her brother Alexander's death in 1973 shifted the full weight of the burden onto her. Aristotle, devastated and in declining health, increasingly leaned on Christina as the guardian of the empire. Yet Christina never shared his appetite for business. She managed it competently, but out of duty more than passion. Her adult life became a carousel of marriages and divorces, each more public than the last. She married 4 times, and each union ended in heartbreak. The tabloids delighted in the stories. But for Christina, each failure deepened her loneliness. She longed for stability, a partner who could see past the billions and the headlines. Instead, she found herself trapped in a cycle of suspicion, unsure whether men loved her or her fortune. Her daughter Athena, born from her marriage to Thierry Roussel, became the one true anchor of her life. Christina threw herself into motherhood, hoping to give Athena the sense of belonging she herself had never known. What makes Christina's story so moving is that it embodies the paradox of inherited wealth. She had the resources to buy islands, but couldn't buy her way out of loneliness. Her story resonates because it strips away the illusion of money as a universal remedy. In November 1988, Christina Onassis was found dead in the bathtub of a friend's house in Buenos Aires. She was only 37. Her daughter Athena, just 3 years old, became the sole heir to the Onassis fortune. To the world, the image was unsettling. Aristotle Onassis's vast empire reduced to a single, small girl. Part 17. The Next Generation. Athena Onassis. By the end of the 20th century, the sprawling Onassis dynasty had narrowed down to a single figure, Athina Onassis, granddaughter of Aristotle, only daughter of Christina, and reluctant heir to a fortune that once symbolized both triumph and tragedy. Her early years were marked by shadows she couldn't yet understand. Her mother, Christina, already struggling with loneliness and the weight of her inheritance, poured her energy into Athina. Yet even this devotion was brief. In 1988, when Athina was only 3, Christina died unexpectedly in Buenos Aires. Overnight, Athina became the sole heir to an empire built on tankers, islands, and myth. Her father, French businessman Thierry Roussel, took on the responsibility of raising her, alongside a Swiss trust managing her fortune. This arrangement placed Athina in a world far removed from Scorpios or New York. Quiet Swiss schools, discreet equestrian stables, and a family environment defined less by glamour than by discretion. To the tabloids, she was a mystery. Headlines called her the richest girl in the world. Yet photographs of her were rare, and interviews non-existent. The contrast with her grandfather's love of spectacle couldn't have been starker. If Aristotle had made the sea his stage, Athina found her sanctuary on horseback. Like her grandmother Jackie, she cultivated a passion for riding that went beyond leisure. Horses became her escape, her rhythm, her anchor. Unlike Christina, who often seemed crushed by her inheritance, Athina channeled her energy into the structured, disciplined world of competitive show jumping. By her teens, she was competing internationally, showing not just skill but an almost aesthetic devotion to training. Riding also gave her something like community. On the show jumping circuits from Europe to the Americas, Athina was primarily a competitor, not an heiress. Her family name followed her nonetheless. Journalists kept speculating about her fortune, which by some estimates reached into the billions, though it was locked away in trusts and complicated legal structures. In 2005, she married Alvaro de Miranda Neto, a Brazilian Olympic show jumper. Their wedding in São Paulo drew enormous press coverage. Yet, like her mother's marriages, Athina's union proved troubled. Reports of infidelity and legal disputes followed, and in 2016, the couple divorced. And then there was Scorpios. The island Aristotle Onassis had transformed into his paradise became, for Athina, more a symbol of burden than of joy. Though she inherited it, she rarely visited. In 2013, she sold the island to Russian billionaire Dmitry Rybolovlev, ending the Onassis family's physical claim to the property that had once symbolized their myth. Today, Athina lives largely outside the spotlight. She competes quietly, manages her affairs with discretion, and rarely gives interviews. Her life contrasts sharply with Aristotle's theatrical displays or Christina's tragic visibility. If Aristotle embodied ambition and Christina embodied fragility, Athina embodies withdrawal, the desire to exist beyond the myth. And yet, even in her retreat, she fascinates. Perhaps because she represents the Onassis saga's unresolved question. What happens when a dynasty narrows down to a single heir? Can a young woman turn that burden into a blessing? Or does the myth consume her, as it did her mother? Athina Onassis's story remains unfinished. She is the heir who turned her back on the empire, the horsewoman who sought freedom in gallops and jumps rather than gilded ballrooms. In her quiet defiance, she has carved out a different kind of legacy. Not spectacle, not empire, but survival. For the last Onassis, perhaps that's the real inheritance.